So like I said, this is a two-part program, so we're getting now to the second part, and we're so grateful that David Burney has joined us. Most of you know him either from his last 10 years as commissioner at Partner Design and Construction. Previously, as most of you know, he was Director of Design and Capital Improvements at NYCHA, and now what's very exciting is he's at Pratt starting up an extraordinary program on placemaking. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you, my pleasure. So the way I'd like to do this is I'm going to, just to sort of structure the discussion a little bit, I'm going to call on 5 people to begin with, just to get the discussion started. 5 people that I think would be important to respond to what we heard this morning. And I do think, the 4 presentations this morning really sort of set the scene. I think, I'm not quite sure whether Bill Mencken's stuff is either inspiring or depressing. The way the Viennese seem to have done it, so innovative. So it's really food for thought. And I thought Nadine really reminded us that it's not just about bricks and mortar, it's also about community, not just the architecture. And John McCullough showed us some examples of what can be done with limited budgets and on infill sites, and perhaps some new direction. And L&M, I was just saying to Rick, I still don't understand how they did it, but that was an astonishing transformation. And I was trying to say earlier, the EIFS, it does have a bit of a bad rap, but I think it's undeserved in some ways. I mean, it's true. I mean, EIFS, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a rigid insulation board covered with an acrylic coating. So it's kind of a little vulnerable to attack if it's at street level, so you do have to keep it across the street. And it does, over time, tend to delaminate. The acrylic, after 7 to 10 years, starts to peel off a little bit, so at least that's the way it was used to be. But the fact of the matter is, you save so much money on the energy savings that you can reclad it every 10 years anyway. So I think it's got an image problem, FS, you need to work on it. So anyway. What I'd like to do, I think to start off the discussion, I think we have to call on Cecil House, because if there's going to be a total reset of public housing, as your boss has said, it's going to be on your desk where it's happening. So you're the man, and I think that more than anybody in this room, you certainly are at the center of this debate, the center of the discussion, at the center of the action here. And it'll be very interesting to hear your reflections on some of the things that you've heard of the presentation this morning. So,
thank you for the invitation. I'm actually very excited to be here with very interesting presentations. As I sort of sat and listened through them myself, the wheels start to turn in your head, and you start to think about the things that others are doing that we could possibly do. I think at the end of the day, the financing conversation at the end was the most telling, because it tells you how difficult it is to actually put together the financing to make some of the things that we're talking about work within the NYCHA context. The mayor has said that we will have a total reset at NYCHA. Our new chairwoman, has been very clear on a focus on reintegrating the residents and the community into the decision-making process within NYCHA. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't start the conversation with talking about the importance of the residents in this process. I think as we start to think about what we're going to do with the assets that NYCHA has, as far as the buildings, the land, the lots, the locations, you have to go back to what is the impact, what is the benefit, what are the implications for the residents that live in those buildings. And there's a lot of conversation around the land lease initiative that we put in place last year. We worked through fairly rapidly to an RFEI process at the end of the year. And clearly, that process is now terminated, and we'll start fresh, a total reset. But it doesn't mean that the idea or the concept is a problematic concept. I think the implementation, particularly when it comes to resident engagement, has to be reconsidered. And I do also think that we have to think about and saying this in a group of architects may be a little bit problematic, but I think we've got to think about the impact on the sort of the social engagement with the residents, and not just looking at infilling or utilizing available properties. So if you start to think about the idea of sort of sticking a building onto a NYCHA campus with the towers in the park, that's a fairly easy challenge for all of you to sort of think through and implement. But if you start to think about a broader issue and a broader challenge of actually using those locations and using that space to solve broader issues and broader challenges, I think that's actually more worthy of, I think, the conversations. As I think about the issues that the residents in NYCHA have: security, access to resources and services. Jobs is a perennial challenge. And as I sort of think through this, to me it's as much an issue of figuring out how to integrate and utilize these assets that we have to perhaps solve some of the financial problems that NYCHA has. But I think more broadly to solve some of the other challenges that we have, whether it's rethinking and replanning some of the spaces that we have that in the 1930s and 1940s that style of architecture worked extremely well. And in 2014 and 2015, maybe it doesn't quite work as well, given sort of the where we are as a society. So I think we've really got to figure out how to not just do infill, because to me infill seems very problematic. But how do we replan or redesign or reimagine the spaces that we have, and while at the same time working to accomplish the mayor's objective of 200,000 units of affordable housing, solving some of the financial problems that NYCHA may have, and addressing sort of those broader social issues like safety and security and access to services and the like. So that's sort of how I sort of encapsulate the challenge that we have ahead of us. To me, it's a much broader challenge than designing a series of buildings to replace or to fill the space that we have. And quite frankly, when I sort of think back to our land lease initiative, I do think that was probably one of the gaps that we didn't see. And when you go out and you talk to the residents, which is really where I think the process for us going forward has to start. You get that. When you talk to them, they talk to you very, very clearly, very articulately, very frankly about the issues, the challenges that they have, and the conditions that make and moving forward with some of the things that we're talking about impossible. And so if you can do that and then begin to figure out how to finance it, I think you've got some projects that really will work.
No, that's very Jim. I think it very much echoes what Dean was saying about I'm very interested to see the Brownsville project, how that coalesces and what the output is at the end. Can we solve that problem of both addressing social inequity and also improving the physical space? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So I'd like to follow up now with Eileen Popkin, who's a graduate of NYCHA, as I am, but is now with the Citizen Housing and Planning Council, and it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on what we've seen this morning.
I thought the concept that you said from the Vienna model, which was those 4 pillars of planning, cost, ecology, and social sustainability, really resonate for what you need to do in thinking about NYCHA development. And what it also says to me is that there are not one answer. I mean, there are, I'm going to get a number one, I used to be able to say 370 developments, 334 developments across the city in every borough. And the answers, and if you looked at the ideas of planning, cost, ecology, and social sustainability, they're going to be different in those different sites. And I think that's really important to recognize that there's not one answer, and that it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of conversation. I like it, I agree with the John Roger, in that it really does start with planning. and really looking at what that site is and what those issues are in that site and what the opportunities are in that site. And talking, playing with the residents is critically important. There was one project that I'm looking at Mr. Bowman because he certainly was involved with it when I was there, which was Prospect Plaza, which was a project which had a very troubled history. But we really worked to kind of bring the residents who were quite angry about what went on there, and rightly so, to create a neighborhood plan. And it wasn't just about the sites, but it was about the neighborhood and what they wanted to see in the neighborhood and how we do that. I believe that project is going forward and will be closing. And I think that kind of process can really work in the worst of circumstances when people are really, really angry. And you can bring it back to centering. I'd like to see that happen more. I think there's opportunities in NYCHA to have that process done in other communities where there's been a lot of discussion to begin the planning process and move forward. So I think there's some fabulous opportunities.
Yeah. And Richard Danford was the architect of the Prospect Plaza project, right? So, yeah. And is that true, just to play on that for a few minutes, how do tell us, what is your view of the social impact of the Prospect Plaza project? Because it was, for those of you who don't know, there were 3 towers, 23-story towers or something in Prospect Plaza?
There were actually 4.
4, okay.
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to participate in this. I think that it's essential that when we start the conversation about resetting what we're going to do with public housing, that you have the residents at the table. Not just me, but also you have to take into consideration the fact that these are neighborhoods that have existed for 80 years in the infrastructure of the city of New York. And as New Yorkers, we have a vested interest in what's going to happen with our developments, our communities, and our neighborhoods. So not just to limit myself to Prospect Plaza is coming along now. It was delayed for a number of years for a number of reasons. Fast forwarding to today, it was a combination of working with the residents and the resetting of the mindset of the Housing Authority's executive department to make sure that we started the process of finishing something that had taken so long. So it is an essential element that must be included if we're going to reset public housing. You have to have the residents at the table in this process from the beginning. You can't just come and drop stuff into our communities, and you have to also take into consideration the fact that for many years of institutional ignorance or institutional defunding of our communities, you have a population of people that have been traumatized by the negligence of the city, the state, and the federal government and the disinvestment in our communities. Something that was said in the presentation today, which I think is very important. When a community knows that the people who made the promise are going to reinvest in the neighborhoods that we live in, or in our facilities that we live in, we have a different attitude towards it. For a while now, the defunding and the disinvestment of public housing by the city, the state, and the federal government have left a bitter taste in the mouth of many of us who live there. I'm a 30-year resident of public housing, and I happen to live in Brownsville. And I'm also a native New Yorker for many generations. And I think that it's really important as we start this discussion that we consider the most important aspect. You're dealing with people. And dealing with people requires that there's a conversation that takes place between them. And that conversation starts today, because we're actually resetting and possibly making sure that we change the policy and budget and planning for the future of the people that I represent in the city and who live in the public housing community. So I think that I've been very fascinated by the presentations. I'm extraordinarily interested in what's happening in Vienna. The process of being able to take public housing and make it affordable for the development process, as well as the process of making sure that it works in the New York City environment, is something that really has to be put on the top of the table. Finally, let's talk infrastructure. There's a social infrastructure and there's a physical infrastructure. Without a doubt, as was put into the survey that I did my homework on last night, housing is part of the thing on the social infrastructure's mind of the city right now. Where are we going to put the people who are coming into the city year after year, and the families who are continuing to grow in affordable places to live? So we need to understand that the social infrastructure of public housing is important, and we have to start investing in it and planning for it in a way that's going to meet the needs of the people and the human beings in public housing in the city of New York.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So let's change perspective a little bit. I'm going to call on Brian Hoffman, who's right here, good, from our cousins across the Hudson, Jersey City. And I'm sure you share many of the issues that we're talking about today with Rancho, and I'm interested to hear your perspective on the sort of.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I feel like a bit of a shill because I've worked with both the Dean and James, so you'll forgive me if these sound like hometown comments. But I'm really encouraged to see some of the case studies that were presented today in terms of reusing the physical infrastructure of public housing, because I agree with you. I think it's both social, but I understand housing. I think we all need to understand housing as part of the physical infrastructure of not just our city, but your city as well. And I agree with James that I think it can be saved. I think some of the demonstrations here today were that we do not need to retreat back to the old Hope 6 model where you're tearing it down and building up new construction. That you can, there's a lot to these buildings that needs to be held on to. And I think that needs to be done in the conversation with the residents, and that's something that the Jersey City Housing Authority prided itself on, is involving our residents from the very initial step of that process. One of the most recent examples of that is we had a site, Booker T. Washington Apartments, that was just wrecked by Sandy. We had 6 feet of water across that site, and people were being pulled out of apartments and boats. And what we did is we went back and we used Cecil's term of reimagining. We went back to that community with a bunch of students from NJIT, and we worked with the residents there to say, okay, this isn't working. How do we reimagine what we have? How do we reimagine not only Booker T, but how do we reimagine public housing? And one of the things that I think is important to recognize in both resetting the relationship with the residents that NYCHA is aiming to do, which I commend, and resetting or rehabilitating the use of the existing housing stock, which again I think we've established today can be done. What I would encourage us all to come away from here thinking about is that we also need to reset or rethink the way that we're financing public housing, because as long as some of the earlier discussions, certainly during the Bloomberg administration, we're geared towards trying to capture essentially economic incentives, profit-making opportunities that were lying dormant in public housing as a way to kind of save it. As long as that's going to be the driver, I think we're going to find ourselves in the same set of problems 5, 10, 15 years from now. We have to really put carts in front of horses and reverse the way in which we're thinking about this and really approach it. And maybe that's, maybe that is the model. That if we're starting with the community and we're starting with the residents, it might keep that from happening. But as long as as long as a lot of this is being driven by how do we make profit or how do we enable profit all from public housing, we're going to have a problem.
Do you have any hope that
paradigm might change. It seems that funding for subsidized housing is on the political agenda as any part of this nation as well.
I'm cautiously optimistic. Yeah.
I think that the residents, there's a voice that people are not aware of, and there's a movement going on nationwide now, because residents are very cognizant of the fact that financing has been driving public housing funding. And I agree. I think that property for public housing has never meant to be. It was a social responsibility that was taken on by people who knew that there's something that you have to do in life that doesn't require making money. So there are several of us who understand that we have political power, to be political and social power. And part of the discussions we were having prior to this year among the residents is how do we leverage the social and economic power of the residents to be able to change the political policy paradigm. So I think that's something in the discussion going forward as we start talking about financing and using the space and having this dialogue with residents. We have to be willing to help to organize with us to put pressure on the establishments, both public and private, and we're really all in the same boat, to change the public policy and the funding process. We represent a large voting bloc. We've got over 270,000 registered voters in public housing. So yes, it can change. We just have to be willing to come out of our silos and talk to each other about how that's going to be profitable for both the development side and for the ultimate goal of fixing the facilities that the residents live in. So I think it's possible.
Well, that's kind of why we're here today.
Just to follow up to that, because I think there's another dynamic component to that, and that is to the extent that funding sources believe that resources are not being effectively utilized within public housing as a whole, it becomes, I think, very difficult to attract more resources. And so as we work to better utilize the resources that we have, whether that's from going from a maintenance and repair backlog of 400 and some thousand below 90,000, or eliminating backlogs in the Section 8 program, or spending money much more rapidly and people beginning to see the impact, you get glimmers of people willing to say, okay, well maybe we can fund a little bit more. So I think that is actually a dynamic that we've got to keep in mind too, because that is a lot of what I hear quite a bit.
Mark, you wanted to?
Yeah, I think things can change. I'm not as optimistic as you are, Brian. The major benefactor of NYCHA, it's major funding, 99% of the time, is federal funding. So it's worthwhile injecting some numbers onto the table. In 1994, the federal government's capital modernization program for public housing in the United States was $3.23 billion. Post-sequester in 2013, the federal commitment was $1.77 billion. So if you adjust it for inflation from 94 to the present, and it just says there's a 2.5% escalator, it should have been about $5.4 billion. Locally, in 2008, NYCHA's allocation to the federal government for capital funding was $333 million. In 2013, it was down to $258,885,000, a 24% decrease. So there's been a steady erosion in federal funding for public housing in the United States. That's under, from 2008 to 2013, under a Democratic administration as president, but confronted with a Republican Congress that is hostile, inherently hostile to public housing. So that forces us, on the one hand, to act politically in Washington, but on the other hand, to look at what resources we have and how they can be effectively deployed. Cecil and I went down to Washington with John Ria, the prior chairman, and Rich Froelich, who is Chief Operating Officer at UCC. We met with HUD to talk about a capital funding deal in 2013. And in fact, we were able to secure the approval of HUD to do this capital funding deal that required taking a portion of that $258 million and pledging it for debt service that would support the issuance of bonds. And HUD approved the issuance, approved the deal, which was a $654 million deal. It provided $470 million for capital improvements and refunded another $180 million of old bonds that we used for capital improvements. But at the time when we met with them, the Secretary's special advisor was very clear to us, and it sort of stuck in my mind. He said, we don't believe that public housing can survive or prosper as an enterprise. Solely, in other words, we don't think federal funding is sufficient to support public housing over the long term. That for public housing to prosper, it will have to leverage its assets. It will have to leverage its assets to generate the type of funding that will enable it to undertake all the improvements and sustain itself over the long term. And that doesn't necessarily mean that public housing is converted, it becomes a profit-making enterprise. It will never be a profit-making enterprise, and inherently cannot be a profit-making enterprise. But it does mean, I think, that NYCHA and the city can look at other ways of financing, just as we did when we did federalization, which was a big, in effect, privatization, except NYCHA is the general partner now of a partnership that Citibank is limited on. Citibank invested $210 million in capital, in equity into that deal, and it resulted in improvements to 20,139 units in 21 developments across the city of New York, and freed up $75 million, or liberated $75 million from the federal government to support its operating budget. So there are ways going forward that we can do things to strengthen NYCHA's balance sheet and to affect repairs, but I don't think, while we need to push at the federal level, I don't think we rely on the federal government to fund public housing in New York City or anywhere in the United States at the level that's needed if it's going to prosper.
Well, that might be a good segue into showing in terms of postdoctoral fellow at MIT and has been looking into financing from land lease issues, and so maybe you could give us your background on that.
Sure. Sure, thank you. Yeah, and just to echo Mark's point, we can talk a lot about ideas for public housing, but if we don't have money to do it, then they just become ideas. And so really thinking closely about the role of federal government, it calls for two responses, right? One is political and the other is being creative about our approaches. So just wanted to take a moment to tie together some themes I saw from the projects and then pose a few questions. So, all four projects really sort of demonstrate that architects, developers, and community organizations, there's a lot of room for creative approaches to some of these problems, both on the land side and on the design side. So we see it in the Vienna housing project, although the gasometer project with the mall was sort of not very well received, but it does represent an innovative approach to addressing the biggest problem, really, which is the problem of land, right? The old saying, land is so valuable because they don't make it anymore, and that's true in New York, if not anywhere else. We also see this in the turnkey project, especially as we regard to infill and creative use of making those top floors duplex apartments in the Lower East Side. So again, room for architects to really be innovative to some of these land constraints. And then in Ocean Village, creativity both in terms of the use of materials, but also most importantly with the financing, right? And I think there's a lot of knowledge to be gained about how that actually worked and how that might be applied to other projects. I think what's most interesting with the Brownsville case is not just this idea that public housing is dense and can be denser, but really expanding the site to the entire community, right? Architects, developers are often focused on buildings, but these buildings are part of a larger structure. There's a social infrastructure that's at work as well. And I'm very happy to see Mr. Bowman here because I just want to echo his sentiments as well that residents have to be involved throughout the development because architects and developers, I think we're often most interested in product, but it's really about the process of how that building is made and making sure residents are involved. So just a couple questions to pose. One thing that was touched upon a little bit, but we haven't really said as much about is this dimension of time, and how do these projects actually respond to users over the life course. So we saw a little bit of that, one of the categories in the Vienna housing grading scheme, I think I wrote it down, is adaptability to changing user needs. And the question is, how can we plan and design projects, not just in the present, but throughout the course of the life of the project, to actually adapt to those needs so that we don't have $100 million in subordinate debt by the end of after 30 years. And I just wanted to pick up on this theme about the total reset and also maybe take a step back. When we talk about public housing, what is the public and public housing that we're talking about? Is it public funds? Well, as Mark pointed out, public funds are declining precipitously, and there's many projects that use public funds that are considered public housing. Is it built by the public sector? Well, we have private developers who are very heavily engaged in public housing. So who is it occupied by? Is it designed for the entire public? I think these are some of the questions we need to ask if we're really going to talk about solutions. Richard Detner and I were talking a little bit earlier. He suggested that maybe we should talk about social housing as a way to eliminate some of the stigma for public housing. I think that before we start changing names, I think we have to really figure out this question of what is the public that we're talking about in public housing.
It might be interesting. Peter Marcuse is here, professor from Columbia, a lifetime student of public housing, and Peter has reminded me on many occasions that we tend to think of NYCHA as one thing, as a federal housing program. But it wasn't always thus, that it had many fits and starts, many sources of non-federal funding. In fact, began not as a federal housing program at all, but as a local housing program at a time of Great Depression, when money was very scarce. So I'm wondering whether, Peter, you might have a more optimistic view of a total reset, since we've had, 7 total resets in NYCHA's history, I think, according to your analysis?
Well, a single comment would be very much along the lines of what you just said, that the concept of public housing is an isolated bubble within a private housing market that ultimately is the best solution to the nation's problems. I think that has to be rethought fundamentally. And the idea that housing should be socially, that housing is a social product and should be considered for its social benefits and not for its profit-making benefits, seems to me very important. And there is, I think, at the same time as there's a very conservative movement by way of the Tea Party and so forth against this whole idea, there's a lot going on in the same direction. We are, for instance, land banking in New York. There's now a proposal for significant land banking. The price of land is a major component of the cost of housing. And in the Depression, land prices were low, and that helped in a sense. So that to look at the issue as having a healthy housing market, I think is exactly wrong. I think a healthy housing supply would be a social housing supply. And there are movements like for community land trusts that also take housing out of the private sector and make it socially responsive, that the housing authorities would also cooperate with and see as part of a general movement towards socializing, not necessarily making public, but socializing the housing system is a good direction. I don't know if you want to go as far as Vienna did in the 20s and call it socialism, but I don't think you should be afraid of that.
So I'd like to call on Nick Bloom. Nick Bloom wrote a book recently called Public Housing That Worked. So maybe you could tell us how it worked.
Well, there's a lot of comments, so some of it I might cover again a little bit. But what works, I think, is we've talked about a lot of constituencies here, architecture, residents, and so forth. But it's really, in New York in particular, it took seriously in the 1930s public housing related to a jobs program too. And I think that when you look at what the housing authority is today with 12,000 employees, it really is this sort of the kind of big government model that they had in mind. And there's some real strengths, I think, in New York to that model, which is a sort of caretaking idea, which really does, I mean, the red brick towers are very similar across the country. I think ours were maybe a little better built in some cases, but what really has distinguished the housing authority is that in spite of tremendous social issues, financial issues, and so forth, the level of basically daily maintenance and upkeep, there is just no equivalent to other cities, where basically places were abandoned. And I have many students who live in public housing and so forth, and they always tell me, a lot of the similar social issues, we'll watch the Pruitt-Igoe myth and say, oh, I recognize some of that behavior about, people are doing things to objects and so forth, but they say, but people come in and clean, and they keep these places up. And I think that really does distinguish New York to this day. And I encourage you to go out to housing developments rather than having more abstract. Maybe the next time have this event at Ravenswood Houses or an actual development. There are many I can recommend to you. That where really you have great managers, you have a lot of people on the ground, and that's really what it takes to maintain this today. And you can even, the whole sort of pathology of the tower block, you can even keep, polo grounds running. 6 elevators per building, 30 stories. But you do need 450 full-time elevator repairmen system-wide to basically keep this system going. So it's not to say that there aren't updates needed, things like technology, labor reform, other things which I think Cecil is engaged in at this point. But I think that sort of notion of labor as a part of the system is really key. And just to give you a little example is that caretakers, this role of caretaker at the housing authority, the person who goes in and cleans the hallways every day, things like that, that person is very frequently someone from the housing authority itself who lives in housing. So they move from basically being kind of a passive consumer of housing. You don't need, I think, a high school degree is basically the minimum. And you can basically go into that and you get a decent job, right? And then and many people have worked their way up through the system to become part of the housing authority as a whole, where they sort of move up. So I think that's key. Now, I'm not sure that the housing authority needs a total reset. I'm not sure, pumping in money is a total reset or something like that. I do think the city, and I see this happening with the recent, the $70 million, basically, no longer charging the housing authority for water and so forth. That's a good idea. That's a good start. But I think that, and police, yes. So I think that the city has to change. The reset has to be as much of the city government as it is at the housing authority itself. Because for 80 years, as many people pointed out, this has been this tremendous siphon of money from the federal government. If you count it over 80 years, right, that basically, while the city did build the city projects and state projects and so forth, when you talk about updating, renovation, you talk about operating, it's all basically come from the federal government. We've even dumped, as you well know, right, we have dumped large numbers of these city and state developments on the federal government for the simple reason of getting money to fix them up. So we've gotten used to basically having public housing as basically this federal responsibility. But it's not a national program anymore. I won't go back through that anymore. Across the country, there's been extensive redevelopment of public housing. So when they talk about public housing in Atlanta or other cities like that, we're not talking about the same kind of thing. Much of that is a very different animal. It's much more private housing. Very often, there are a lot more upper income people or higher income people living in it. The housing authority is still, and even increasingly, the housing authority of working people, but also poor people as well. And that really makes it different. So when I think about what a total reset looks like, it's not just $70 million a year. It's basically the city as a whole has to decide that, it's going to be, as the recent study the housing authority did, you're going to need $17 to $20 billion over the next 15 years. It's not going to come from the federal government. The housing authority needs to be the reset, to my mind, is it needs to be part of the budget process of the city of New York. And that kind of money we're talking about, $1 billion a year, and then by 2020 we'll have a total reset. But that's basically where I stand.
Yes, Simon.
One of the things that struck me, and coming originally from HPE, and working with affordable housing, so NYCHA, and also as public housing, is this what I felt was a very strong disconnect between the conversation of affordable housing and public housing. Mm-hmm. And affordable housing, over the course of the last couple of decades, has moved in many directions, where sort of public housing, the thought about it was, stagnant is not the right word, I don't mean, but it sort of was staying, working one way. And when you listen to Rick and Richard talking about what they did at Ocean Village, they were using very complicated financial tools and design architectural tools to really rethink how that Mitchell-Lama building could be done. That has to happen with public housing, but there also has to be a recognition of public housing that some of the things have to change in terms of the language we use and how we think about the financing. You know, someone said, was talking, it's about making money off of NYCHA. That wasn't the discussion. It was about how do you leverage the resources that you have. They were leveraging resources at Ocean Village. They're leveraging resources in the proposal for Section 8 that NYCHA issued. And that leveraging resources is just common to every affordable housing. But somehow when you get to public housing,
now, Mark, is that because of the constraints imposed by HUD? That there isn't more freedom to asset manage?
I think HUD is infinitely more flexible than it was in the past. So, you know, I think, for instance, out in San Francisco, they're talking about doing what's called a RAD deal, 5,500 units. Essentially, it would be like our federalization deal, where the units are sold to a partnership comprised of an affiliate, a general partner comprised of an affiliate of the Public Housing Authority, so they, the general manager, the general partner, and then the limited partner is an investor, which is a passive investor and a back end to the deal that ensures that Public Housing Authority maintains control of the project in perpetuity. So that was the model we used on federalization. They're looking at a similar deal, I think, somewhat similar, in San Francisco, where they would do what's called RAD on all 5,500 units of public housing in San Francisco and leverage literally probably tens of millions of dollars of private equity to do this deal. But the equity, it's free money in effect from the federal government. It's another form of federal subsidy. It's not as if the return on the equity that the investor puts in comes out of the cash flow of the Public Housing Authority. It's just they get tax credits. So it's another form of federal subsidy, but the Public Housing Authority maintains control over the properties. Now this is a complicated deal, and when we did federalization, I think it required an enormous amount of work on the part of NYCHA, meeting with tenants, talking to them, walking them through the deal, and alleviating, assuaging all the fears and legitimate fears that they had that in fact this was privatization, that public housing was going to be stripped away from them and that their futures would be put at risk. So there's a process that we have to do with deals like this. It's doable. NYCHA did it with federalization and can do it in the future. And I think HUD, frankly, again, they do not believe, at least at this moment, at the level of HUD Washington, that just left to its own devices, left to the stream of federal funding, that NYCHA, that public housing is going to be able to survive and prosper in the United States. Local housing authorities are going to have to leverage their resources. As I mean so.
But do you not see it as at least partial privatization?
No. I mean, I don't know, the better judge of this is Cecil. It's in private hands now, but the partnership it owns is controlled by NYCHA. If you go to those deals, it walks like a NYCHA deal, it talks like a NYCHA deal.
No, but that's federalization. So we actually have an application in for a RAD deal as well.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. So assuming that HUD approves it, we'll see if we can move forward with it. But some of the financing techniques that we're talking about sort of have social implications that to date have been acceptable in the rest of the country and unacceptable in New York. So a lot of these complicated financing that ultimately result in privatization or some other kind of structural changes in the rights of the residents, et cetera, have not been politically palatable here. So that creates sort of a box in which we have not been able to operate. Even going forward with getting the RAD deal approved that we did, at the end of last year, and we'll see if it goes forward, it was fraught with a lot of concern with how that was going to be met. At the end of the day, the residents in that location decided that having their units fully renovated, having a steady stream of operating funds to operate the building, having a steady stream of capital funds to keep the development up and running was better than the consequences on the other end. But I think in addition, there are other things that NYCHA is doing, similar to the things that have been talked about around the table. So coming out of Hurricane Sandy, in the locations that were impacted by the hurricane, all of our boiler rooms and meter rooms will be elevated in a more resilient way. We will attempt to do sub-metering where we can sub-meter for electrical use, for sustainability purposes. We have plans to, whether we're going to use EFIS or something else, to reclad a couple of the developments as we move forward. We'll see if we get funding for all of that. But the plans and the ideas are there. And I think we have a fairly complicated, I think, refinancing transaction that's going to take 6 developments and hopefully fully renovate them as we go forward. So there are things that are conceptual ideas. I think the challenge is actually getting all of it implemented. And the social dynamic with the financing is what I always find very interesting, because that's as much a conversation within NYCHA as it is about how to structure the transaction. The structuring of the transaction, to me, seems to be easier than actually getting over the political and social hurdles of execution.
And those hurdles are the perception of privatization. Is that the major?
Well, I think that's one of them. Mm-hmm. That's one of them. But the impact on privatization is a big driver in a RAD in the RAD transaction, for example, because while we think we can structure it where we retain ownership, if we continue to operate it, our operating costs simply are higher by definition than some private operators. So we have a fringe benefit loader that not many private companies will bear, and our operating costs are substantially more than others. So when you start to look at how do you, from a cost effectiveness perspective, sort of make these deals work, you have to be efficient from the caretaker all the way up.
I think there's a right way to do this, at least on the privatization side or semi-privatization side, by bringing tenants in early and making them part of the process and getting them to buy in. When we've done this probably 5 or 6 times in the past couple of years on a couple thousand units, and it's always when we go into a property that's in a distressed situation, the tenants are always worried about getting kicked out, rents going up, and past distress and not actually doing anything, whether they had owners that previously didn't do what they said they were going to. So by keeping them in the process and sort of keeping an open line of communication with the tenants, it's made our life a lot easier. And when you actually do what you say you're going to, it goes a long way. And do it quickly when you roll out a program. It gets the tenants on board because they're going to get a new kitchen and bathroom, a new community space, something like that.
That was true.
Yeah. So, Mark, how much is there really out there for the RAD deal? I mean, we're not going to RAD 180,000 units of housing.
I think it looks to me like HUD's budget for RAD is going to be pretty steady. I think they're really committed to doing RAD. And I think, as Cece said, I think you do RAD, you're moving, I think the form of tenant protection changes from perhaps what existed if you're a public housing tenant. On the other hand, and Eileen maybe can correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the largest sources of families heading into the shelters are families coming out of NYCHA projects, which I found to be a stunning fact. But maybe your boss told me that, Geraldine.
I think that might be wrong.
But there's a screen.
I think that's...
but the point is that merely being a public housing tenant, or not merely, but being a public housing tenant doesn't immunize yourself from being a tenant and being exposed to the possibility of eviction. So the form of legal protections can change, and we should look at that to ensure that people are really protected. But even as a tenant of public housing, that doesn't give you permanent tenure in a public housing building. You could be a victim.
The RAD is capped at 6,000 for New York. And the program is tapped out nationally at this point unless Congress increases the number.
Yeah, the program was initially funded to 60,000 units, and it was fully subscribed, it was oversubscribed, and they're talking about upping that allocation, because more expensive, there is definitely a sea change at HUD, under Donovan. I don't think it's pushing, if they can get these 60,000 units to work, it looks like they're gonna push to convert almost all the public housing staff to rent.
Part of the perception here, again, about financing and privatization, you said privatization, and that's a very bad word to use around public housing residents. I, for one, was a staunch supporter of the federalization bill, and I've always believed in finance deals because around the country it's been being used for more than a decade to refinance property when there were no other sources of funding to do certain things. Realizing personally, and now I'm not speaking for the group, I'm speaking personally, realizing personally that in the real world, we have a time clock. These buildings are 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30 years old. And the longer you take to figure out how to take care of these physical facilities, the more damage is going to be done, and thus it's going to cost you more money to do it. And so there must be alternative ways of financing these things. By and large, I would say 40%, 45%, maybe even 50% of the residents are not against finance use, because in the end of the day, whether the contract is for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, it's going to take care of the immediate problem of financing the repairs and upgrading the conditions, and at the same time guaranteeing that these facilities are going to be there. So I think that this financing and what the gentleman at the other end of the table is discussing about being creative and making sure that you contact and discuss this with the residents is very important. It goes back to what I said at the beginning and what Mr. House said. Resetting what's going on has a lot to do with your relationship with the residents in public housing in New York. Without a doubt, it's the largest group of residents, and in order for us to really take on this behemoth of meeting this backlog and actually restructuring and refitting these buildings, you're going to have this dialogue, and you're going to have to use financing deals going forward. If we don't, we'll be fighting a political battle that is going to make the building's time clocks get worse. The other thing that I argued with other political people about this, New York has the Port Authority, the Dormitory Authority, the School Construction Authority, all these authorities that get bonded every year to do capital and operational things. The New York City Housing Authority seems to be on the junk list, where they don't get the kind of bonding from the city or from the New York City, what do they call it, the public, the development corporation.
They have a bond authority that Mark just described.
I mean, I know they just did another one, but this was something after we pulled teeth with people. And we shouldn't have to pull teeth to get bonded like the rest of the authorities. I mean, the New York City Housing Authority is controlled by the state government. They make the rules to appoint the chair and then give the power to appoint the chair to the city. They don't give us any money. All right, so we have to change that discussion so that we get bonded or funded like any other authority.
Well, I think Mark seems to feel
if I could just add something, Richard. You know, the deal we did, the federalization deal, was done with buy and cap, which is, a limited amount of tax-exempt bond financing that's allocated to states on an annual basis, on a per capita basis. But, and that costs, there's a cost to that. Either it's paid out of the cash flow of the deal, or as in the case of the cap funding deal, the expense of debt service on those bonds comes out of the capital funding stream out of the federal government. The one place where there would be a cost would be to return to what the city in fact did in the past when it subsidized those 21 deals that we did federalization in. And that's what we refer to. That the city put in its capital budget a line for NYCHA. Whether it's $50 million or $100 million a year or $150, but the city make a decision that it's going to devote a portion of its capital budget to financing the improvements in NYCHA over a 10-year period of time. That will increase the amount of debt service that comes out of the expense budget, but you can calibrate what's a reasonable, how much you want to increase that amount, or you take it out of somebody else's hide. But I think if there's going to be a concerted effort, frankly, to repair NYCHA's buildings and bring them up to reasonable standards, then the city has to revisit the capital budget, and it has to fund out of the general obligation bonds.
That was one of the principal political agendas of the resident leaders since 2010.
And it's
line item,
it's
public
defensible
housing back into the city budget and the state budget for that matter, so that we can leverage that line into what you're talking about.
Jim, you had it.
So I'd like to make a comment to bring it sort of more back to the ground, because we go to a number of NYCHA sites, and the staffing of NYCHA sites, the maintenance staffing, and the supers on the job, they have suffered attrition because of the cut down on the budget. And I think sometimes we meet a super who goes to Home Depot and buys a sump pump because he doesn't have the support or funding to do it. We meet other supers who are managing sites that we've seen more about than they have because they don't have the staff to cover the sites. And so the impact is it's not just the capital improvements or modernization, it's really the maintenance of what's there. And I think that's a critical issue because I think that impacts on the residents because the buildings are not being able to be, they're not maintained. And I feel badly in the places that we go to, but I think it's all budgetary restraints. And I think that's an area that really is a starting place because I think NYCHA must be able to maintain what it has even without the modernization of capital improvements as a sort of a base to start with. That's sort of what we see, so I wanted to share that observation.
Let me just
have to say, David, I really hope that Jim's data is dated. Because we recently consolidated our supply chain organization and we doubled our supply budget across the authority and we've consolidated buying so that if a super is going to Home Depot, then they're violating our procurement policy. We have contracts in place to deliver directly to that location almost everything that they need. This is fairly recent, the last 6-7 months. Yeah. And at a much better cost than what we were getting at Home Depot. And actually we have some things in the process now that will continue that. And we've staffed up significantly. So in the last year, we've transitioned almost 1,000 employees. So the 12,000 number that Nick mentioned is now 11,000. But we shifted about 1,000 employees to the front line. So 500-600 more caretakers, 300-400 more maintenance workers, lots more plasters and skilled trades folks to actually to do the work that needs to get done. I think there are still vestiges of sort of issues. I think the challenge that we have in that regard is dealing with the civil service hiring process. It takes us a long time to actually hire up. And so we do have, we're finding we have sort of dips in our staffing because we can't get through the hiring process in the city. So we'll dip and then we'll come back up. And so we're now figuring out how to sort of overhire to actually smooth out the dips in our hiring. But it was a challenge in the past.
But I want to just put something else out there for discussion, and that is in terms of the definition of total reset. If you go up to Harlem River houses, built in the late 30s, still in the height of the Depression, but there you see, first of all, a kind of interesting typology of walk-up buildings around courtyards, but you saw at the time daycare, health clinics, retail stores on the street, a branch of the New York City Public Library. This was holistic community planning. This wasn't just the brick and mortar. This was also about the services. Is there any way that we can get back to that type of total reset where we're thinking about building communities and not just building the brick and mortar?
I think if you look back to those times, those were times when the federal government funded NYCHA in a fairly substantial way. And in addition to NYCHA being more than adequately funded for operations and adequately funded for capital, there were fairly large social programs in place. And as funding has declined holistically, which we talked about a little while ago, the shift, the prioritization, right, has been to preserve the physical asset, and we have slowly moved out of the business of providing social services. So last year we transitioned 45 community centers to DYCD, some senior centers to DIFDA, and that sort of was a continuation of NYCHA moving out of some of those more social services.
But it was a way of sustaining those services within public
But it did, absolutely. And actually, I think at some levels it improved the overall service offering for the residents that were there. So, I think there's a balance. The funding, though, shifted substantially outside of NYCHA to the city budget, and in a more sustainable model. And it freed up resources for NYCHA to devote more into maintaining the physical.
Maybe the pre-K movement is an opportunity to bring some of those resources back into public housing again.
I would think that HPD actually plays a role here in supporting NYCHA. And as Eileen said, every kind of development has its own texture, and in some places HPD has land holdings quite close by, especially in Brownsville, where we have the flexibility to add in more community service type uses with our development. Funding is much more flexible than NYCHA's, obviously. So where we can support NYCHA developments with new affordable housing developments, with new retail and community services nearby, I think is a great complement of HPD's services with NYCHA's.
The pre-K movement, we do see quite a few of our locations being utilized, hopefully, to the benefit of NYCHA residents in the city's pre-K program. So we'll see how that plays out. The city issued an RFP early on. We submitted quite a few sites within NYCHA for that purpose, and we would assume, given the populations, the proximity and the locations and the size of some of our developments, that quite a few of those sites would get selected.
I think one of the resets is also what's our definition of community, and I think we need to have a slightly more expansive definition than just the NYCHA development itself. I know when I got to NYCHA, it took me 6 months because no one talked in neighborhoods.
Right.
They talked about Linden Ingersoll, they talked about Harlem River houses. It was only names of developments, and I kept going, is that in Brooklyn, is that in the Bronx, is that in which community board is that in, is that Highwood? I couldn't figure it out. And I do think it's a benefit to look at, when you look at community solutions, they're talking about Brownsville. They're not talking about pink houses and Marcy houses, and they're talking about Brownsville. And I do think having that neighborhood discussion is actually what we need to do today to sort of better integrate public housing with the community and the community into public housing. So I for one think that's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's done well, done with HPD, done with city planning, done with DIFTA, done with the city agencies, I actually think that's a positive.
That's actually one of the dynamics that I thought about in the reimagining conversation. As you talk to residents in certain of the developments, they do seem to be separate and self-contained from the neighborhood. And you have developments that are close by, and people don't necessarily even go to, across the street to the other developments. And so the idea of being able to reconnect developments holistically to their communities, and I think architecture actually does play a critical role in doing that. I think that would be a huge objective and I think a big social benefit to residents and to the city.
But so does urban planning. The fact that NYCHA campuses are called campuses, they don't really have streets. And one of the ideas that I think we really need to talk about is the remapping, not the demapping, the remapping of streets to try to engage these campuses in the fabric of the city. These are isolated, kind of spatially insignificant in the sense of really tying in to the community. That means retail at the ground floor. It means intervening, maybe partially infilling, partially even demolishing, partially expanding, retrofitting. But this is about being part of the city. And being part of the city is very much about the fabric. And that one of the very, very difficult things about the NYCHA form is that it is non-fabric like. And I think, you know, there's some hope for architecture here. Because this is what every architect, every planner, every urban designer has been talking about, how we need to rethink the way we make community. And one of the ways you make community in an urban environment is by making it landscape. Exactly.
So Mark and Mark, and Mark, there's two Marks down there, so Mark, we got Mark's.
You know, NYCHA projects are towers in the park, but they're also islands in the city, and in some ways they're sort of, given their funding stream, federal enclaves in the middle of a municipal city. So trying to figure out how to build bridges between those enclaves and the broader community is, you know, I think is really a critical undertaking, and something, if you're talking about a total reset, thinking through that with agencies like with HPD and city planning, you know, thinking about how to restoring it into the fabric is kind of a major undertaking, but a really vital project that everybody will benefit, not just the residents of NYCHA, but also the residents of the surrounding community. You know, we can lose sight of the fact that during the 70s and 80s, while all the neighborhoods in the city of New York, outside of, you know, below 96 Street, were falling apart, you know, that the NYCHA projects were anchors in those communities. And those were the strengths in the communities, not the surrounding community. NYCHA was a strength. And without being nostalgic about that, you know, it's clear that there's strengths in both areas. We have to figure out how to build that fabric between them all and make the whole neighborhood a stronger place to live in.
It still anchors to those communities, because one of the things the Housing Authority commissioned a study last year, the cost of rehabilitation versus the cost of replacement, and the economic impact of the New York City Housing Authority in New York City and New York State. Our communities, public housing communities, are still anchors, economically especially, because without a doubt we spend money every single day in the city, and the local businesses that are around the bases of our developments, they clean up. And that's to put it mildly. I mean, these guys make money. And so we have to realize that building us back into the fabric, we are part of the fabric. The conversation that we started a couple of years ago was changing the image of public housing. It's important, and again, I go back to what I said about being invited to participate in this. The fact that residents are usually treated like a petri dish, something to be studied, has to be changed. And we have to be not only included in discussions like this, but the whole idea of the public relations of where public housing fits in the city and who we are and how much we are a part of everything around us has to be changed. 1 in 12 New Yorkers live in public housing. And I would safely say that, you know, a lot of us, as you go across the city, public housing is almost like a family, and somebody somewhere has somebody in it, or somebody in their family was in it at one point in time. So I agree. I think it's very important for us to be not just thought about woven back into the project, but as the mayor resets things, he has to speak about public housing from his podium to make sure that the city gets it from his pulpit, that we are actually a part of the city. And also around this table, as we continue this discussion of reset, we have to start including public housing as a discussion of your neighbors and your friends, and not just a red brick and mortar eyesore that sits out the
I want to go to Mark Salvato and then to Sunny.
Yeah, I'd just like to get feedback from the room on a couple of concrete ideas for financing some of these upgrades. My firm is Stephen Winters, just energy, sustainability engineering. We've gotten engaged with a number of different divisions with NYCHA. It's an interesting experience. One resource NYCHA has is being very data rich. Specifically, the energy division has an amazing database of energy use across the portfolio. We got engaged with them last year because we had just completed our study for Deutsche Bank Foundation that looked at all the energy retrofits done in the New York City affordable sector over the past few years. And the crux of it was, given this existing condition in terms of energy data, what could we expect on the back end? We overlaid that on top of NYCHA's database, where you have this amazing documentation of energy existing conditions in terms of per square foot usage. And we found something just in the fuel savings alone, $75 million annual savings potential to reduce cost-effective savings potential at a 10 or 12-year payback. That's about $1 billion investment. It's not a 15 or $20 billion investment that's needed over the however many years, but it's a significant chunk of change that could certainly support upgrades that reduce operating costs with the HUD, then figured out, and also improve comfort and quality of life in the buildings. I think more significant than that is the public health benefits of some building interventions. We're doing a study right now with Coney Island Housing out of a HUD Healthy Homes grant, where basically the concept is it's great that you can reduce energy operating costs a few $100s a unit, but what if you could reduce the number of asthma visits? I mean, that's an order of magnitude more important and significant from a dollars and cents standpoint and from just a public policy standpoint. So we've just completed a holistic ventilation upgrade at some of the Coney Island projects, and are really trying to understand the public benefits to see if there's a way to close a loop on, reduce asthma visits and the money needed to pay for this sort of enhancement. So on the energy and on the public health side, I would just appreciate if there's any comments or feedback on if those are opportunities to...
One question I have, whatever happened to the ESCO program? Where ESCOs were companies would come in, they would fund the capital improvement to reduce your energy costs, whether it be insulation or boiler controls and so on, and they would pay themselves back from the energy savings, and then NYCHA would get the benefit thereafter. Did that program continue?
Yeah, there's still some in place now. And we did an $18 million EPC last year, similar type of program.
What would be interesting would be to get health insurance companies to invest in that type of public health improvement and then reap the benefits themselves in medical costs, but they're not quite there yet. I'm thinking...
Actually, there is one in Minnesota that...
There is?
I think it's Mercy Housing. It's actually a partnership with the health insurance company that's developing the housing. The insurance company's developing the housing because they realize it would actually reduce health insurance costs.
Well, you and Mark need to get together after this, this discussion. Sonny, I'd like to hear from you.
Going back to MetLife in Stuyvesant Town, right?
Hey, that's right.
Sometime, I wish somebody would do a study of the cost of not reinvesting in public housing. Some of those same questions as to what have we saved all of these 80 years for helping people get decent, fair, safe housing. The National Public Housing Museum is in Chicago, which is probably the poster child of failed public housing. Most of it is down now. It's those of you who've been in public housing now go down State Street. It's back to Prairie pretty much, or some mixed income, supposed mixed income development. And the jury is still out as to whether we have been transformed or not. It's a complicated agency, and it's a complicated program, but we think that the museum being in Chicago can lift up a lot of the issues that you're all talking about, including the architecture. We have 2 or 3 really stellar examples of how public housing was redesigned using the basic buildings that were there. Some of them are just beautifully done. The CHA does not like to advertise that because their plan really was to wipe out most of the high-rise, well, all of the high-rise in essence. And there are now 37,000 Section 8 vouchers and something like, I think we're down to maybe 30,000 units. So there really has been a change. But I think the purpose for the Public Housing Museum is to study the history so that it's not repeated, so that we can learn from it, and also to change the stereotype of who lives in public housing. When I tell people, when they look at me, I'm middle class or better foundation, I just resigned from the foundation I ran for 21 years. Jewish, white, and lived in public housing for 12 years, it's a disconnect. They just don't understand it. But the Eastchester projects in the Bronx was a really good place to live. And I think that we need to change the stereotype of who lived in public housing, who lives there, what they contribute to the society, and how many of us there are. The alums, there might be an alumni association, which is something that we are looking into. And those of you who are close to public housing residents, we really want to do an extensive oral history program. I'm going to just stop there, otherwise you'll get a whole treatise on that.
Suzanne Schindler, I wanted to ask you to.
Sure, I mean, there's several strands. First of all, I think the issue of the rhetoric is important if we talk about affordable or public or whatnot. And I think part of the PR that needs to be done for all housing and for public housing in particular is all housing is public housing. That's sort of the phrase that people centers put out, but everything is subsidized. Luxury housing is subsidized. Every affordable housing is subsidized, and I think we should bring in the question of the bad rap of Mitchell-Lama, which came up implicitly. Oh, Mitchell-Lama, hands off. But I think that was a model, that there was an attempt to make a non-profit model, a large-scale non-profit model of housing. There were some problems, so I think that would be something moving forward. In the broader sense, you say that 12% of New York City lives in public housing, but there's still, and you subtract the 1% at the other end, there's still a substantial part of people who can't get into public housing, they can't get in anywhere else. So what kind of models does the city, if we're talking about city level, need to promote? And I think a reset of Mitchell-Lama would also be the time, and especially looking at Vienna. I mean, you made it sound like that's all public housing. It's not. The city has a big leverage, but those are all, a lot of those are nonprofit cooperatives that are driven and founded by very particular interest groups. The Coffin Factory, spectacular architecture because the residents were involved early on in determining how they wanted to live also. So I think there are other models that we have to consider.
Happened to Mitchell? I assume Mitchell and Lama are long since gone. So whatever happened to Mitchell Lama? It sort of died? Or...
It expired, but at some point, and the city, because you have both city and state supervised Mitchell-Lamas, both the funding for those ceased. For a variety of reasons. It's interesting looking at those developments because in fact, the average rent in a Mitchell-Lama is lower than the average rent in a tax credit deal in New York City. So in fact, they're an enormously affordable source of housing, permanently affordable, but also, just like NYCHA, in many instances, they needed enormous amounts of capital improvements, repairs. For instance, Ocean Village, where they were shamefully neglected over many, many years, partially because of big disputes between the original developers and the supervising agency, in many instances, the state. So, complicated scene.
I think Peter is probably the answer.
I was wondering, in terms of the relation between public housing and the community, public housing isn't just a resource for its tenants, but for the whole community. Couldn't it tie in with portions of de Blasio's program, for instance, by offering space for pre-K in public housing or in health clinics? Goes back to the original history of public housing, which was seen in that way. But that could help financially also. But it bring public housing into the mainstream of the political discussion.
They responded to the RFP for pre-K apparently, so there's some possibility that may well happen.
We have a large number of clinics that rent space in a development. So quite a few of our developments have retail space on the bottom level. The ones that actually front the street tend to be very popular, but there are quite a few clinics, and that's something that we actually look for to occupy that space because it is providing a service, a critical service to the residents of that community.
I wanted to ask you, Abby Hanlon, you put together some deals that have been both market rate and supportive housing and social services. So you've made it happen. You want to talk a little bit about how that's done?
What I've been thinking, the thing about the triangle that I have the honor to participate in, and that was one that we haven't talked a lot about, and that was public sector, certainly private sector, put me on the side here, and not-for-profit. And my partner in the work that I did is sitting right there. It wasn't at Community Solutions at the time, but it was Common Ground. And together, the three, the triangle, we were able to create 217 units of supportive housing, which is different funding sources, different model, but not different need, serving very much the same or similar population. And I think that as public housing has lost the funding that was once available to it, let's not ignore the triangle that I call out here, because I think it's a critical piece of the triangle to understand the way in which not-for-profits like Community Solutions and many others can contribute to the gap that we find in putting together what I absolutely agree. I look at it, and again, I enjoy very much working with Bill on the Vienna model. The notion that housing is a human right, period. It's not a politically appropriate notion here in the United States. It is a much more accepted notion. It's a social notion of housing. I don't feel that we're in a political place at the moment where that is going to be accepted, no matter how much one works towards it. So I think we have to creatively, reset, reimagine, and incorporate everyone and all of the aspects of resources that are available out there. And let's find a role for not-for-profit, for-profit. I'm happy to be a part of that. I'm happy to be sitting at this table. I thank you for being, I feel like the least informed in a sense, but at the same time, I want to be here because I think it's important that the for-profit, private sector be a part of the dialogue. There are those of us who and we have creative ideas. And I have one last thing to say, which is I went to a very fascinating conversation 2 weeks ago with an author named Alice Osborne. She is a writer who writes in Europe and was head of the Design Museum. She wrote a book called Hello World. And she talked about design and in a way that I think is very apt for this table, this group. It's that design is not just the aesthetic, of course, outcome, but that it's a really critical method of approaching problem solving. And that the design of social thinking, the design of economic thinking, and the design of the physical product really needs to be thought of in this holistic manner. And I think, for me, the notion of reset doesn't ignore the aesthetic issues of the housing, doesn't ignore the social issues of the housing, and doesn't ignore the economic issues. We have to constantly think of this in its pieces, but nonetheless, that the pieces have to come together as a whole.
We might take a couple more comments. We're over time, but let's see what we're doing.
So it's dawning on me actually that like what Abby, Jonathan, and Eileen have been saying, to me it seems that there needs to be a reset of the silos that we're in, right? So it's yes, I've done supportive housing. There's a financing structure that is available to affordable housing developers, and there is a population that we're serving within supportive housing. That's not the same as the housing authorities. It's a completely different structure, and actually a different population, really. And I think that sort of integration of, or marrying of those two types of developments is probably something that we should be looking at. And then also like the conversation Eileen and Jonathan you were having about like breaking down the fabric the design, and the overall community, that also has to, I mean, we shouldn't only be looking to NYCHA to solve the problems of NYCHA. We need to be looking at what are the assets. NYCHA is an asset. 100% NYCHA's not going anywhere, and the buildings aren't that bad. It's an asset. And what else in the community should we be connecting with? What other buildings, street corners, libraries, to create a community, a neighborhood that's not Van Dyke houses, Brownsville houses, and they do not meet. And so I think it's all of those things, the silos need to be broken down if we're gonna actually reset NYCHA.
One of the inspirations for this colloquium and gathering was just that. We're at the beginning of a new administration. Before we all get kind of solidified in our silos, we thought that the IPA was a great idea to put a lot of people around a table from all of the various aspects of city making and to have discussion and a free-flowing discourse on ideas of how to make NYCHA work, how to make our city work, how to integrate the funding stream. The discussion itself, whether something concrete comes out of it, my sense is that we're sort of laying the groundwork here for a potential roadmap, let's say, for a new RFP. One that's more inclusive of the residents, one that really takes into account for-profit developers, not-for-profit developers, supportive housing, affordable housing, maybe even market rate housing. I know it's a tough thing, but the only way that we can start is to get people around the table. And I'm hoping that this gathering leads to more gatherings. It was a long haul to get all of you here, but I really have to say, Karen, you did a wonderful job. And I think we're somewhere where we weren't before. I think.
Well, it kind of begs the question, Jonathan, of what to do next, because it seems to me that if we are going to follow that up and break down the silos and look at neighborhood planning in a holistic way and think about brick and mortar and community, it's probably going to have to be city-led, whether it's HPD or city planning. It's going to have to come from that sense. So the question then is, how do we incentivize the new administration to go in that direction? And I wonder, how do you see, okay, so the IPA's done this event. What do you see as a potential follow-up to not just let this be a one-off, but to have it continue?
You're going to have to ask Karen.
Stay tuned. No, we're very excited. I think this is, I mean, like Jonathan said, it was all about bringing you together. The very next steps is you'll see a video online. Architect has graciously agreed to do a roundup, so that will be an easy, digestible way for people to understand what's coming up in these discussions. And then the next step from the IPA in several weeks will be an online project, which will be next. And then we'll keep you posted on exactly how it develops.
So Karen has all your emails, so she will relentlessly pursue you from here on. So.
I also think that one of the things that we do with the Housing Authority is we put together task forces. We have a safety and security task force that we meet with the regular group. And I think it's important as a resident because part of me is cynical. I've been participating in a lot of this stuff for years, and I'll be 62 years old this year, and I've seen a lot of stuff in this city. So I think that one of the things that the residents would like to see is a serious commitment. We've seen a lot of promises and a lot of vest pocket stuff happen, but what would really warm my heart is that this is not just a one-shot deal and that nothing limited comes out of it, but something as expansive as all the ideas that have been expressed here today.
I think you can do a lot of that in NYCHA in these RFPs and you can leverage private dollars, have a requirement to work with a nonprofit, have a requirement to sort of reweave or reconnect the NYCHA buildings to the community and do that in a way that's sensitive to the residents and is in partnership with like it's a real public-private partnership.
Well, I'd really like to thank our panelists, Bill Makin, Richard Weinstock, Rick Croker, Nadine, and Jim McCullough. Thank you guys for the presentation, and thank you all for coming.